December 9th, 1987. A humid evening in a small Midwestern town where the factory whistles still mark the hours. In a two-room apartment above a corner grocery, Thomas Hale hummed while he washed dishes, the radio murmuring a late baseball game in the background. He was 32, steady, the sort of man people trusted to show up on time. 2 kids, a mother who lived down the block, a job at the plant that paid the bills, and nothing more. Nobody would have called him remarkable. He liked his lawn mowed straight, his coffee black, and he kept his promises. That ordinary steadiness is exactly what made the accusation stagger his neighbors. 1 week later, a woman in a nearby neighborhood was found dead in her home. The police were under pressure. The mayor wanted answers. Journalists wanted quotes. And in the absence of another suspect, the investigation came like a tide toward Thomas. He had been seen on the street that night, someone said. He had exchanged words with the victim once, a neighbor remembered. His house key was the same type found in an evidence bag, the defense later learned. No single piece was ironclad. Taken together, the picture looked terrible. The arrest was quick and public. Handcuffs clicked at the elbow. Cameras snapped. His children watched from a doorway as their father was led away, and the ordinary hum of the neighborhood shifted into something sharper and colder. In courtrooms, ordinary lives are often reinvented in shorthand. The polite neighbor recast as a suspect, the weekday worker reduced to a line on a police report. The prosecutors told a simple story that fit the headlines. Witnesses answered the questions set before them. The jury heard fragments, and whether by coincidence or law's machinery, those fragments assembled into a verdict. Thomas was convicted and sentenced to life. Prison did not begin with the metal doors. It began in the way people stopped crossing his path, the way invitations dried up, the small acts that, over years, become a different kind of confinement. Friends he'd known since high school stopped returning his calls. The mother who used to borrow sugar from his wife now offered condolences in public, but kept her distance in the grocery aisle. Letters arrived at first, then fewer, then none. Inside concrete walls and under fluorescent lights, Thomas learned the routines of a life others had chosen for him. Work details at dawn, roll calls, a catalog of petty humiliations administered by guards and by the boredom of long days. He also learned how a system meant to punish crime can, without malice, become a machine for erasing ordinary humanity. Prison stretched time into a different shape. Days bled into months, months folded into years. Thomas learned the small economies of survival, where to trade a cigarette for a favor, which guards were bearable, which cellmates kept to themselves. He learned to sleep through the clank of late-night patrols and the distant rumble of trucks on the highway. He learned the language of apologies that came too late. The neighbor who couldn't quite remember the night in question. The witness whose memory softened under cross-examination. The reporter who moved on to fresher scandals. He learned that being innocent did not make the punishment lighter. It only made the injustice sharper, the pain that never softened. Back home, the world changed without him. His wife kept the house for a while. Then the strain of single parenthood and public shame wore at the edges. The children, who had watched their father led away, grew into teenagers with a new kind of carefulness. They learned to answer the question, "Where's your dad?" with practiced neutrality. They learned the looks, the polite pity, and the thinly veiled suspicion. Birthday parties arrived with empty chairs. School presentations required explanations. Job interviews required small lies. Those small erasures accumulate. Over the years, the family thinned. Some relatives sent letters that read like weather reports. Others disappeared entirely. Inside, Thomas fought small battles that mattered more to his heart than to any legal record. He joined the craft shop and learned to carve wood, a skill that produced gifts for his daughters on holidays he could not attend. He taught himself to read law books with a patient attention, not to replace counsel, but to understand it. He wrote letters daily, even when replies dwindled, because writing was a way to keep a life from becoming only a file. He kept his dignity in the narrow places where dignity could be kept, in how he folded his shirt, in the way he swept his section of the workyard, in the spare jokes he told to younger inmates to help them through their first bitter months. The legal fight began as small, halting notes pushed through the system, appeals, petitions, a pro se motion filed with the help of a sympathetic paralegal. For years, those efforts vanished into a bureaucratic dark. But the seeds of eventual change were planted by two forces that did not exist in the same way. In 1987, forensic science and stubborn outsiders who refused to accept the finality of a headline. As DNA testing matured in the 1990s and early 2000s, cases once thought closed were being reopened across the country. Innocence projects and public defenders started to look at cold evidence with new eyes. A prosecutor in a neighboring county, reviewing archived cases, noticed inconsistencies in witness statements. A local journalist, returning to the story for a retrospective, found the forgotten lab report rotting in an evidence locker. Those fragments reached Thomas through a chain of small human interventions. A law student visited the prison to interview inmates about cold cases for a clinic project. One of the students read Thomas's court transcript and found passages that didn't match the physical evidence. She mentioned it at a clinic meeting. A pro bono lawyer took an interest and filed a motion for testing on a piece of evidence that had once been described as inconclusive, but had been preserved. The motion was met with routine resistance. Evidence doesn't move on its own. Courthouses require paperwork, judges require cause. Prosecutors require a reason to reopen the files that once closed neatly in the public eye. There were hearings where the state argued the chain of custody was unreliable, where the defense had to prove preservation rather than guilt. The process felt maddeningly slow, stitched together by bureaucracy and human caution. Each delay was a merciless reminder that time was still being stolen. Then, finally, a lab agreed to run tests. The sample was small. The swab had sat in a paper envelope for decades. Modern techniques can sometimes coax clarity from decay, but they cannot always. The day the lab called, the small legal team gathered in a cramped conference room with a single phone and a cheap coffee maker. Someone held a folder, someone else had a hand over their mouth. Thomas, who had learned to temper hope, sat quietly in his cell and listened through the prison phone as the world outside held its breath. The lab results were not a neat miracle. They were, instead, a quiet unmaking of a story that had been assumed true for decades. The swab returned a profile that did not match Thomas. It matched no one in the state database. It contradicted the testimony that had once seemed to fit so easily into a headline. For the legal team, the report felt both like a vindication and a reproach, proof that the machinery had failed him, and proof that the machinery could, with persistence, be forced to repair itself. A motion to vacate the conviction followed, filed with the careful, low-key urgency of people who had learned not to trust fireworks. Court dates were set and reset. The prosecution, embarrassed but bound by duty, conceded parts of the case they could not defend without appearing willfully blind. Witness recollections unraveled under renewed scrutiny. Inconsistencies that once appeared insignificant now read like cracks in a wall. The judge, after a hearing that felt to many like watching a slow stitch come undone, signed an order vacating the conviction. The word exonerated was used by counsel in a post-hearing statement, and newspapers printed it in careful, astonished type. But Thomas's release was not a movie's final scene. The gates opened, but nothing outside had been waiting with balloons. A small group of volunteers met him at the prison exit. The paralegal who had first filed the motion, the law student who had read his transcript, a reporter who had refused to let the story die. There were hugs, and then there were practicalities: paperwork, a bus ticket, a court order, a phone number for a social worker. He stepped into daylight that smelled of diesel and late summer, and for a moment the world seemed too bright. Returning to a life interrupted is a negotiation. Jobs require histories. Landlords require references. Family trust requires years to rebuild. His children were older, with lives shaped by his absence in ways both small and seismic. Reunions were not cinematic reconciliations, but awkward afternoons of catching up around a borrowed table. Some relationships stitched back slowly. Others had been lost entirely. He found he could laugh without immediate suspicion of irony, but the laughter sometimes arrived a beat late, a habit learned behind bars. There were public consequences, too. Editorials praised the forensic advances that had freed him, and then shifted their attention elsewhere. The local paper ran a piece that tried to be fair, and readers left mixed comments online. Relief, outrage, a small echo of the suspicion that had never wholly left. For Thomas, the most persistent wound was not the headline or the comment thread. It was the calendar of lost summers, the missed birthdays, the slow erosion of possibility that cannot be repaired by a court order. He had aged in a different time. The world had moved on without him. Yet even amid the practical hardship, there was a fragile kind of recovery. He returned to the workshop where he had learned to carve. An old friend helped him find a part-time job at a nonprofit that taught crafts to returning citizens. He spoke to law classes and community groups, not as a celebrity, but as a cautionary witness to how systems fail. He learned to accept small kindnesses without suspicion, and to say with a modest pride that he had not allowed bitterness to harden him completely. His days filled with routines that were human-sized: coffee with a neighbor, the careful tending of a small garden, visits from grandchildren who listened to his stories with puzzled fascination. The larger fight continued elsewhere. His case became one file among many in a national conversation about wrongful convictions, preservation of evidence, and the limits of eyewitness memory. It inspired modest reforms in the county: better protocols for evidence storage, more regular reviews of cold cases, a small fund to help ex-NREs with re-entry. These changes mattered, but they never replaced the years he had lost. In the quiet of his kitchen at night, Thomas sometimes traced the edges of the life he might have lived: graduations he'd missed, a daughter's wedding he never saw, and understood that justice, when delayed, is never whole. Years later, the shape of Thomas's life was quieter than anyone in his old neighborhood would have predicted. The small victories accumulated in ordinary ways: a steady morning routine, a neighbor who waved from his porch, a telephone that rang with more friends than creditors. He learned to let go of the public version of himself, the one assembled from headlines and rumor, and to live only by the private standards he could control. He kept a photograph of his daughters on the mantel, and a stack of letters tied with string, each one a relic of a time when words mattered more than verdicts. Those artifacts became for him a different kind of history, proof that a life can survive a legal erasure and still be lived. Still, survival is not the same as repair. There were nights when he would wake and count the years he had not been home, when the simple acts of fatherhood felt like a list of missing entries. The community that had once turned away did not all return. Some apologies were private and sincere, some never came at all. He accepted what he could, visits that lagged in arrival but meant something when they came, a job that paid just enough to feel honest, a small garden that required his hands and offered a steady, uncomplicated reward. In these tiny, repeated labors, he found a dignity the courthouse could not award and the headlines could never take away. For the county, the case became a cautionary ledger. Protocols were rewritten in thin, utilitarian memos, a log for evidence, a second signature on chain of custody forms, a yearly audit of cold files. A few prosecutors started to meet with innocence clinics before announcing case closures. Those changes were technical and small, the work of administrators and committees, but they mattered. They lowered the chance that another ordinary man would be swept into a narrative that did not belong to him. The reforms never restored Thomas's lost summers, but they made the machinery less likely to lock an innocent life into iron by accident. There is a particular cruelty in delayed justice. It asks the wrong to be patient with a system that has no timetable for mercy. Thomas's story shows how modern tools, better forensics, persistent journalists, law students with energy to spare, can bend that timetable, but it also shows the limit of correction. A vacated conviction rewrites a file. It cannot unwrite a childhood or resurrect the quiet birthdays that passed in an empty chair. The legal system can free a person, but it cannot grant back the years the person lived under the weight of a public mistake. When people ask him now what he wants his story to mean, he avoids rhetorical grandstanding. He says simply that he wants to be remembered as someone who endured without becoming embittered, who tried to teach his children how to trust again. He speaks at a community center about the fragility of memory and the care required in making accusations that change lives. He sits in the back of the room and watches young faces listen, and sometimes a hand goes up with a question about evidence or about forgiveness. Those small conversations, he says, are the work of real justice, not the dramatic exoneration headline, but the quiet, day-to-day rebuilding of trust. If there is a last irony, it is that the story that once closed a life now opens conversations. Newspapers will still write about the terrible headline and the too fast conviction, but the more lasting legacy may be quieter. A modest policy change, a clerk who double-checks a file, a law student who chooses public defense because she met a man who taught her to read the law with patience. That is not the same as undoing the past, and it never will be, but it is a beginning. And for a man whose life was once measured in lost time, beginnings are worth everything. He lived long enough to see the smallest changes matter. In his 60s, he planted an oak in the yard behind the community center, a deliberate, slow gesture, something meant to outlast headlines and legal filings. Neighbors who had once cross-stepped his path now nodded as they passed. Children who had known him only from a headline came to his talks with school assignments in hand, and left with new questions about evidence and consequence. He watched grandchildren learn to tie shoes, and he learned, with an awkward humility, to accept the small, ordinary joys he had been denied for so long. There were days when sorrow returned with surprising force. On the anniversary of his arrest, he would sit by the window and let the memories arrive uninvited. A birthday missed, a joke he never heard a child tell, a dinner that had been eaten without him. But those days became fewer as the years accumulated good mornings and small reconciliations. He found that people could disappoint him and still be forgiven, that the hurt could be carried without becoming the only thing that defined him. When reporters asked what kept him going through the long, grinding years, he did not offer a tidy moral. He spoke of a stubbornness that had nothing to do with righteousness and everything to do with habit. The habit of doing one's work well, of answering letters, of carving a small wooden toy and placing it in an envelope for a granddaughter. He credited the strangers who spent unpaid hours rereading transcripts and the students who treated old files like puzzles. Most of all, he credited time not as an enemy, but as a slow, indifferent companion that, if you survived it, would sometimes hand you back a life you could still shape. In the end, Thomas's story was neither a triumph nor a tragedy so much as a caution, a reminder that institutions are made of people and therefore brittle, and that justice requires not only laws, but constant, quiet care. He wanted no monuments, only better procedures and a quieter vigilance. If a county clerk now double-checks a chain of custody because someone refused to let a case fade into a drawer, then some portion of his lost decades has been repaid. He would say, if asked, that freedom is less about dramatic headlines and more about the small, returning practices of trust. A neighbor bringing soup to a stoop, a teacher believing a student, a lawyer refusing to accept a convenient narrative. Those are the things that, stitched together, hold a community intact.